All right, hello, good afternoon. I'm Julia Kowalski, and I'm an assistant professor of global affairs at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, where I'm also a concurrent faculty member in anthropology and in gender studies. I'm delighted to welcome you to the series Mediating Justice, which I've co-organized with Katherine Martineau, assistant professor of Asian studies at Binghamton University, who also joins us today. Hi. We've been generously hosted in this event by the Kroc Institute of Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Before I describe our series and introduce today's guests, and in the spirit of justice and seeing its absence, I would like to recognize that today's conversation about justice is organized on the lands of Native peoples. The University of Notre Dame resides on the traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee, the Miami, the Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. We have created this series to bring together anthropologists and peace studies scholars in order to discuss how ideas of justice thrive in particular contexts. We are inspired by recent events that have demonstrated yet again how complex yet urgent justice is as a concept. Such events range from the systemic inequities that have been exposed by COVID-19 morbidity and mortality, to widespread social mobilization around the United States against racist police violence. In order to explore questions of justice, however, we turn not to philosophy or to jurisprudence, but to the institutions and interactions that enact ideas of justice. We are asking, how do everyday practices reflect, reproduce, and change prevailing approaches to justice? Rather than seeking a universal definition of the term, we hope to explore how concepts of justice are mediated by the interactions, institutions, and conditions in which they are used. This series thus seeks to expand our understanding of how justice works, including how it might work as a normative goal for justice-seeking scholarship across disciplines and fields. And so in pursuing this project today, I'm delighted to be here with two scholars, Professor Will Garriott and Professor David Anderson Hooker. Will Garriott is an associate professor in the Law, Politics, and Society program at Drake University. His research and teaching focus on the relationship between law, crime, and criminal justice, broadly conceived, with a specific interest in drugs, addiction, policing, and governance. He is the author of the book Policing Methamphetamine, Narcopolitics in Rural America, which addresses the impact of methamphetamine and more generally of the war on drugs on everyday life in the United States. He has also edited several volumes on policing and on addiction, and is also the former co-editor-in-chief of Polar, Political and Legal Anthropology Review, which is the flagship journal of political and legal anthropology in the United States. David Anderson Hooker is Associate Professor of the Practice of Conflict Transformation and Peacebuilding at the Kroc Institute of Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, affiliated with the Keough School of Global Affairs. He has worked with communities, governments, and international NGOs and civil society organizations on post-conflict community building, environmental justice, and other issues of public policy and social justice. Professor Hooker is also a lawyer who has represented the state of Georgia as an assistant attorney general. He is also president and principal consultant of Counter Stories Consulting, where his work focuses on narrative alignment for civic, community, and faith leaders. He also is the author of the book, The Little Book of Transformative Community Composting. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about your work and your interests. The conversation that we're going to have today is open-ended, and I'll begin by posing some questions and inviting each guest to reflect on their individual perspective. And so to both of you, I ask, what is the role of justice in your work? How does justice operate as a focus of study and as a concept for the communities and individuals you work with? How do questions of justice shape your methods and research practice? And I'll invite Will to dive in.
All right, well, thank you for that question, and thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. So my work for the past 15 years or so has really been looking at the institutions of justice in the United States, and in particular, the criminal justice system. So my dissertation work was looking at the response to the methamphetamine problem in a rural community in West Virginia. Since then, my research and teaching have really focused on all aspects of the criminal justice system, but in particular, the institutions of policing and punishment. And today I'm looking at marijuana legalization and have a specific focus on the state of Colorado, which is somewhat arguably the first place in the world to move from a prohibitionist policy to a market-based tax and regulate approach to governing marijuana. And the through line for all that work has really been the war on drugs. And looking at the way the war on drugs has impacted the criminal justice system in the US. And the more that I do this work, the more that I look at it from different perspectives, the more amazed I am by just how deep and profound that impact has been. So it's really not too much to say that we absolutely would not have the criminal justice system we have today were it not for the war on drugs.
Great. David, we'll pass things to you.
So for me, there are two places that I'm working where justice is deeply implicated. One is for the last 15 years working in South Sudan in the aftermath of their several years, multiple years of multiple civil wars, the separation with Sudan and South Sudan. And then the other place is Southside Chicago, the Chicago Torture Justice Center. So, which came about, Chicago Torture Justice Center came about as a result of a 20-year reign of torture by police against Black and brown-bodied people on the South Side of Chicago to elicit confessions. Some of them were accurate, some of them were inaccurate, but all of them were extracted based on torture. And any number of people were placed in prison and on death row as a result of torture and extracted confessions. There was a major reparations ordinance that we were able to win for Chicago, and then the process of building a torture justice center that seeks to do reparations. The question in each of these cases is, with regard to justice, is Ferdinand de Saussure would say that justice is an ineffective signifier, which is to say that people don't use the term to mean the same thing. And so when you're trying to approach justice, then how do you get a community in a post-conflict or in the space of widespread, officially sanctioned harm? How do you create spaces that occur as just, sufficiently just for people to begin to reorganize themselves as community? And the approach to that has been very different in South Sudan, where there's been recurrent violence, cycles of victimhood and violence, and in Chicago, where we've moved away from institutional justice as it's currently organized in order to seek justice for the people.
Thank you both. You were both very concise. And there's so many directions to go in. I think, listening to you both describe your work, something I'm struck by is the extent to which you've both engaged with criminal justice systems, both of you from a variety of perspectives. And in particular, I'm sort of curious to know, at the same time that you've had these various engagements with criminal justice systems in the state, you've also, both of you have thought very deeply about narrative and the role of narrative, right? Like even the label, the war on drugs, is a narrative that obviously has huge impacts. And so I guess my first follow-up question for both of you is how do you see the role of narrative in ameliorating or engaging these questions around these criminal justice systems that may or may not be serving the communities that you're most familiar with?
So this idea of narrative is really fascinating for me because it's where I moved away from just straight mediation or straight legal action to recognize that the narratives, the dominant and subdominant and counter narratives, are what shape and distribute power within communities. And so you can't just undo systems. You have to look at what I call legacy and aftermath. Legacy being the stories that are received, the mythology, the folklore, the history, the lies that get passed down, and the structures that are set up in affirmation of those stories, because if you just undo one without undoing the other, then they will continue to reproduce. So you have to look at both of them at the same time. So one of the things that has never been the case in the United States, at least, is that there's never been a narrative of full humanity of Black and brown bodied people, which allows then the war on drugs to go unnoticed. And so, and how the narrative has to change when you have real people, because of methamphetamine, who are involved. And so you have to change your narratives. And so you notice that there are these larger narratives, not just of justice, but justice in relationship to race, and justice in relationship to economic position, and justice in relationship to gender, that you always have to notice as the larger scope that is shaping and animating what is considered a justice-seeking behavior or justice-seeking institution.
Yeah, narrative is absolutely key. I think one of the things that the institutionalization, both in literal institutions, but also more ideologically, you might say, of the war on drugs, is that it shapes the stories we can tell about the problems we see. And as a result, it shapes our thinking and really our imagination about how we could respond to some of those problems. There's a kind of building off what David was saying. One of the things that was particularly interesting researching the war on drugs in rural West Virginia was this moment, and you saw this narrative reproduced at the national level, when these rural communities and then the wider spectatorship of their communities were saying, well, wait a minute, what do you mean there's a drug problem in the rural United States? That narrative, that was an inherent conflict because of the way that the war on drugs had been racialized and spatialized up until that point. So to see that there was a drug problem within a predominantly white rural community just did not compute with the prevailing narratives about where the drug problems are and who has them. At the same time, there was no capacity for thinking differently when it came to a response. So one of the things I found within communities is there was nevertheless a really deep desire for a punitive response and an immediate turn towards the criminal justice system when people were thinking, okay, we've got this methamphetamine problem, you know, we've got people like making it down the street. We've had houses blow up because they don't know what they're doing. We've got people using in our families, and it's causing significant harm to them, to their kids, you know, the real kind of tangible interpersonal problems. The criminal justice system was still the only institution to which people were really primed to turn in that context. And so coming back to this issue of narrative, one of the things that's very interesting to me as I now look approximately 15 years later at marijuana legalization, I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at how those campaigns for legalization have occurred. And what people who were doing the political work, what they have really done is tried to change the stories we can tell about a drug like marijuana as a way to get people ready to accept different approaches to governing that drug. So it begins with a lot of talk about medical applications, stories of patients, people who really could not find successful treatment outcomes in conventional biomedicine, who have nevertheless been able to find treatment outcomes with marijuana or cannabis. But then also just thinking about its harms relative to something like alcohol. If you look at the number of, say, overdoses that come from marijuana every year versus that come from alcohol every year, well, alcohol is a much more harmful substance in that regard, and yet it's something that's really woven into our everyday lives. So I think narrative is important for how we respond to things as they emerge in our lives. And one of the things that the contemporary legalization movement is trying to do is really change the story that we tell about substances like marijuana or cannabis so that we can be more open to regulating those in a less prohibitionist fashion?
So one of the things that we're working on coming from the other end of that is not just narrating how you can talk about or the stories that you can tell, broadening the range of stories you can tell about drug interactions or about a particular drug, but broadening the understanding of what makes something just, what makes a society just. Because in most cases, law has always been accompanied with order. Law and order go together. Law and justice are almost always separated, at least by a comma, if not placed in different sentences, because they don't necessarily relate to the same set of concerns. We're still trying to concern ourselves with justice, with creating a space for equity where everybody has the opportunity to fully flourish. And many of the carceral systems and the carceral mentality that's attached to the institutions doesn't really align with that. And particularly in the United States, where those carceral institutions have a connection to slavery by another name, the big loophole from the 13th Amendment, we have to rethink the whole notion of where justice can be crafted and take it away from the current the carceral systems in order to pursue justice, which then allows us to tell bigger stories about the work. And so our narrative work in pushing community is to reimagine, to have a different signification when we talk about what justice is actually being sought.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question there. I'm really loving this conversation about narrative. And David, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to reparations as a narrative process, because it seems like in that space, you're trying to convince somebody else to accept your narrative. It's not just community work, it's actually demanding or beginning to assert something from an institution that the reason you need it is because they've completely shut out that narrative, right? Mm-hmm. They've denied the capacity for Black people to have this narrative. So how do you, can you speak to that? Thank you.
So the reparations ordinance in Chicago was, I mean, I can't say it's easier. It was still a 20-year push to get it enacted, but it was more manageable because it was a set of incidents. It's a demonstrable set of incidents, and the people, the actors were all still living. They were tangible folks. And so the reparations on a broader scale is more difficult because the historical harms have been embedded in so many systems and structures that people have become accustomed to, have accommodated their lives to. So separate communities, segregated schools, segregated and differential healthcare systems, and all of the compounding advantages and disadvantages that a broader reparations ordinance would need to attach to, or broader reparations movement would need to attach to, are much more difficult because it also embeds people's identity. You know, your identity was built on a level of superiority or inferiority of a particular community, and a reparations push on that broader scale would try to address all of that. That's much harder to do. And so reparations in more contained incidents, the Japanese internment, the Greenwood massacre, you know, those are places where you can get a hold on it. And yet, it still requires a level of acknowledgement that many people aren't necessarily willing to make. And so how do you create levels of acknowledgement that allow for people to recognize that a historical event has currently compounding advantages and disadvantages? That's the place where you're constructing a narrative towards reparations.
Can I jump in on that a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
So the issue of reparations is an enormous question in the marijuana legalization movement right now. And when Colorado passed its law, and really going back to state regulations that went in place in 2010. One of the big compromises, if that's the appropriate term that was made, was with allowing people who had been justice impacted, which is to say people who had felony convictions for drug crimes in particular. Those folks were explicitly excluded from working in the legal marijuana industry. That ban on people who had felony convictions was repeated in the implementation of the 2012 Amendment 64 is what it was called, but the legalization initiative at that time. When rulemaking took place, they were so concerned about creating a firewall between the legal and illegal system that anyone who had been convicted of a felony was excluded from working in the legal marijuana industry for 5 years. Anyone with a drug felony was excluded from working in the industry for 10 years. Well, you know, that period of time right after legalization was called the green rush for a reason. There was huge economic incentive to get in on the ground floor of an emerging, what is coming to be a multi-billion dollar industry. And so there is systemic exclusion of folks who had been justice impacted from participating in that green rush. And given what we know about the disparities in who was arrested for marijuana in particular, drug crimes in general, but who's arrested and who is not relative to who uses, there's an enormous racial disparity there. And so one of the big negative outcomes that has continued to haunt the movement is the fact that the folks who were most likely to have been arrested under prohibitionist policies are least likely to benefit economically from the turn towards legalization. And so, of course, the inverse of that is true. Those least likely to have been arrested are now the ones who are running dispensaries and whatnot and making lots and lots of money. Mm-hmm. Since Colorado came on board with theirs, other states have identified this problem and have tried to introduce social equity measures. Colorado kind of just came around to this really as a result of the protests that happened this past summer. And so there's now an equity initiative that is in place. And, you know, everything's in the details of how rulemaking is going to go. So I've been sitting in on or watching recorded Zoom calls of these rulemaking, very contentious rulemaking meetings where people want to ask serious questions like, well, look, certain folks were excluded from participating in this industry for 6 years, 10 years. We think they should have exclusive access to licensing in kind of new economic ventures that are resulting kind of from some different legislation that's been passed. Those folks should have exclusive access to those licenses for 10 years as a basic way to equalize that. And of course, you know, some people are very in favor, some people are strongly opposed. So that's, I think, one of those contexts where the issue of reparations is really being struggled with in a significant way. And I don't think anyone's come up with a good way to really address the significance of the harms perpetuated, particularly in communities of color as a result of the war on drugs.
And part of the way that I try to narrate this notion of justice and equity, as opposed to talking about reparations, which is often a trigger issue, is how do we make decisions that mitigate the compounding advantages and disadvantages? If we are a system, if we are a community that's based on notions of equity and meritocracy, how do we at least create a space in which the compounding advantages and disadvantages of previous decisions can be redressed so that as we move forward, we don't have to have these conversations anymore? And so not talking about it as reparations or even talking about it as justice, but talking about it in the inside of that mythology of meritocracy that the United States larger dominant, you know, myth and narrative is based on.
I love that idea of redirecting meritocracy towards justice, which is not, as currently configured, a particularly just or equitable system. Katherine, I saw your mute also went off.
Yeah, I'm interested in how what you're describing is almost like a kind of public relations work involved in moving people who maybe historically and for centuries perhaps have been really controlling institutions and working for the subjugation of, and I'm especially thinking about Black citizens in the United States who are facing this just incredible, as you were saying, kind of compounding inequities generationally. And Will, I'm thinking here also about addiction as a kind of embodied process, and how much of the injustices that we're talking about here are deeply embodied. And so how do we, when you have institutions that are so thoroughly set up to subjugate and oppress, that the work of beginning to get any kind of purchase on them is so, there's so many multi-prongs. But on one hand, we have the movement from that, was not this summer, but where it really came to, in some ways, some visibility this summer that it wasn't previously. And how, Will, you're seeing that that's having an impact on, so we have some real positive effects from this kind of activism. But on the other hand, you also don't only want to work against, but you want to pull in the institutions. And that, David, maybe some of your work is kind of working on the other side, where it's trying to pull people in with a kind of narrative. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit, maybe both of you, about sort of when do you work against and when do you pull in, if that makes sense.
So Buckminster Fuller teaches us to not argue against a system, but to build a alternative model that is so compelling that people will want to join. So the entire transformative justice effort, the whole approach to transformative justice, is to create spaces that allow people to visualize a possibility where justice happens outside of policing, outside of institutional policing. Then you'll get police, some of whom become curious about how to be involved in justice efforts over here. And so part of it is, it's not a push and pull, it's not an over or against, it's a creation, it's a creating a narrative of a shared future. Like, how do we, in Greensboro, with the police, with Black Lives Matter, with Latin Kings and Queens, with other groups, we ask the question, how do we create a Greensboro in which everybody feels safe, protected, and respected, right? And so then the matter of push and pull is internally to seeking an answer to something that everybody's actually committed to, because everybody declares themselves committed to creating a world in which everybody feels safe, protected, and respected. Some just are more willing to use violence, and some are willing to use extra institutional matters. And so we have to do some pushing and pulling inside of that, right? But the idea is to create a future that pulls us, not necessarily trends, because we may have to create a disjuncture from current institutional structures, which is what things like defunding the police and decarcerating systems is about, is creating the possibility of disjuncture, if not from the institutions, at least from the narrative.
So one of the trends that I'm looking at as a kind of parallel trend to what's happening around marijuana legalization is what Oregon did very recently around a more widespread drug decriminalization. So I think, if I remember right, I think this maybe kind of begins on Monday, but they looked to Portugal, which since, I believe, 2000, 2001, decriminalized all illegal drugs. Within, if you had basically a personal use amount on you, you were not subject to criminal penalty. you were at most fined. And in addition to that, and this is something that Oregon did, Portugal did, and I think it's absolutely key for anyone who's going to pursue this kind of policy, they replaced the police response with a more public health harm reduction oriented response. So it's changing the ecology of the systems and institutions that respond to problems. And so, for instance, if you are a person who uses drugs, you use injection drugs, instead of being harassed by police in ways that encourage you to be more at risk of, for instance, needle sharing, which is a huge public health issue. There are actually opportunities for you to get clean needles. If you desire to go into treatment, not everyone does, but some people do, you have greater access to that through the systems that are in place. So for me, I'm very curious to see how that works, not only on its own terms, but in many ways as an alternative to what has happened with marijuana legalization. So decriminalization simply seeks to remove the criminal penalties and replace them with something else, to shift the institutional structure. What they are not doing is creating a for-profit commercial market and industry around one substance. One of the challenges of that approach, of that commercialization approach, is, there's many, I'll highlight two. One, when you say this substance and only this substance should be treated differently, it has the effect of allowing people to double down on the rest of the system. So, well, of course, heroin needs to be illegal. Of course, cocaine needs to be illegal. We're just talking about marijuana. And secondly, as soon as you have industry involved, I mean, there's some really great things about taking a market-based approach, but the reality is, as soon as you have an industry involved, that industry is going to start advocating for itself, and its concern is with profitability. So if you look at the way the laws have developed in Colorado, again, it was only from the social protests that took place this past summer that really forced the issue. It was only then that social equity concerns were really put forward in a serious way. Up until that point, the kinds of laws that were considered every year during the state legislature were really business oriented. And some of those had a positive impact on what we might call justice concerns, but in large part, they were kind of narrowly tailored. We think this is good for our business. And so we have both of these things happening at the same time. And to kind of bring it back to where this started with the push-pull, and thinking about narrative, as we were talking about earlier, I think as we have different models that are seen as viable, we start being able to have different conversations, and the range of futures we can imagine for ourselves starts to expand in a really productive way.
And I just want to notice that when you were talking about addiction and treatment and things like this, that is an indication that the pursuit of justice it requires a whole of society approach, because it's not just that drug addiction can be considered separate from mental health needs and social support needs. And, because so many people who don't have access to legitimate healthcare systems will self-medicate, and dual diagnosis and self-medication. And so the places where the greatest drug treatment and mental health treatment, the largest providers in every major urban area is the county jail. LA County, Fulton County, Cook County. And so if we're having a whole of society approach to justice, then we recognize that justice doesn't just happen in the so-called criminal justice system and in policing, but it happens throughout. Justice is a value that has to be considered in every aspect of our decision-making and the way that we produce and construct our community systems and the places where people can flourish.
So if I can just say one thing on that. I teach this class called Law and Order, basically an intro to the criminal justice system. And one of the books we always read is Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? And why we do that is because she makes the abolitionist case for getting rid of prisons altogether. And it's not something most 18-year-olds are really ready to have a conversation about, not because they lack the intellectual capacity or because they're so committed to prisons, but because we are just, and this is her point, we are so primed to think that these institutions are necessary. And to a degree, they are necessary if we want to maintain the society that we currently have. And so one of the things that I deeply appreciate about that book, which I have to say was, I continue to really be stunned by how ahead of its time it was. I think it came out in '03. So before any of this was really in the mainstream conversation. What I love about the book is students always want to say, well, if we don't have prisons, then what are we going to do with the bad people? What about this? What about that? And that's precisely her point, is when you take prisons away, you have to come up with different answers to that question. The whole institutional ecology has to change. And that whether you agree with abolition or not, the question that it forces us to ask, the reality that it forces us to confront, is one that I think is very important. And again, it comes back to the point that you were just making about finding justice in these different spaces, and how we need to be intentional in that work.
So we are actually running out of time. This has gone so quickly. So I know, David, it looks like you are about to speak, but I'm going to invite you to speak in a manner that is a little bit driving a bit towards a conclusion to our conversations, and what you sort of want the audience to take forward, what you might take forward. Something I've been profoundly struck by listening to the two of you talk is that without this kind of holistic, I would say radical, like hitting at the root of these systemic issues, just how easy it is for something like drug addiction or the sale of drugs to move from being regulated by a highly disciplinary criminal justice system to a highly disciplinary set of discourses about public health, or a highly disciplinary set of ideas about markets and capitalism, and just how much that underscores David's point that we have to take this really holistic view of transformation, because there's always these other kind of disciplinary projects waiting to leap in and solve these problems on their own terms. But I will invite you both, perhaps starting with David, to conclude.
So in our push, particularly in Chicago, because it's so prevalent, but a little bit also in South Sudan, we push this idea that policing is the assurance that values of the community are being affirmed, which is why Amish people police themselves, and other communities police themselves. And so how do we have policing where communal values are actually being affirmed? If we do that as a portion of our pursuit of justice, then we will recognize that the justice systems actually don't affirm the values, and that policing as it's currently constructed don't affirm communal values, which means that we have to have conferences of some sort where we bring folks together to reassess, where we have the opportunity to renegotiate who are we the people, and then have all of the we the people participating in the articulation so that justice can become a effective signifier and everybody has an understanding of what we're pursuing together.
So the working epigraph for the book that I am writing on marijuana legalization comes from the character Don Draper from the TV show Mad Men, and it is, if you don't like what's being said, change the conversation. I've chosen that in part because I think that is precisely what has happened around marijuana legalization, and why we're at this moment, which, as someone who really kind of came of age in the 80s, 90s, the idea that you could go just buy a joint legally, legally it's complicated, but legally, just really at this point in time, really was unfathomable when I was 17, 18. even 25, something like that. And the way that that happened is that folks who were involved in this issue provided folks with different ways of thinking about how we could do the work of regulating, governing, whatever, marijuana, or even just what place it could possibly have in our lives. Now, the catch is that only certain stories, only certain conversation shifters really resonated with folks. And they needed those things to resonate because this was going to be a vote, and you need the majority of people to vote for your thing. And what was very clear in Colorado is that social justice arguments were not mobilizers. Tax revenue mobilized, money for schools mobilized, stories about personal freedom and limiting government impact on individual choice. All of that mobilized people, as well as the big one, which is this idea that marijuana is safer than alcohol. And that's something they harped on for a decade and then got enough people to buy into. And so I think for me, as I work on the issue of marijuana legalization, I really see the significant gains, but also the significant costs. And the way that, while there's certainly been positive things that have come, and I think each state that legalizes does it in a slightly better way, particularly when it comes to justice issues, we have to acknowledge that those compromises were made. So there are a lot of triumphalist narratives about legalization that are out there. And in my work is trying to acknowledge the significant change that has happened while also acknowledging the cost that had to be paid along the way. So such as the exclusion of people who actually serve time for doing what people can now do legally and make a lot of money, the exclusion of those folks from the industry. So for me, I don't know what kind of summary that is, but it's certainly where it gives some sense of where my headspace is at this point as I think about issues of justice in the context of marijuana legalization, criminal justice system, current efforts to reform, and the war on drugs and what its potential future might be in this country.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today and participating in our virtual event series. This has been a fascinating conversation. So in addition to thanking the two of you, Katherine and I would like to thank everyone at the Kroc Institute for their support. And in particular, we'd like to thank the director of Kroc, Asher Kaufman, communications director, Hannah Heinziker, and events manager Lisa Gallagher for their support of this series. We invite you to join us to watch our other dialogues during February and March, and to join us for our series Capstone Live event on April 7th, featuring Professor Kamari Maxine Clark, who is professor of anthropology at UCLA and is author most recently of the book Affective Justice, the International Criminal Court and the Pan-Africanist Pushback. We hope you'll be able to join us. Thank you so much.